just get out there and do it and include people with disabilities in all aspects of our lives, whether it's work, whether it's education, whether it's transportation and housing, and sports. Make sure that people with disabilities are equally involved and use ATP. Ask the person. Don't make up in your mind anything that will be prejudgmental about what you think the value or the ability of that person is. We employ 250 workers with disabilities. As a human being, you judge. And when I saw them for the first time, I judged, subconscious. I thought to myself, I know the capabilities of that individual. I was wrong 250 times. So just do it.
Were you too young to know you were a girl or a boy?
Oh, I hated the skin that I was in. I thought I was ugly. I thought I was unlovable. I couldn't leave my house without people staring at me or making rude remarks.
There was a sense, I think, or a message that many of us have received that it's okay to be a Jew as long as you're the right kind of Jew.
Just imagine what it would be like for you when you get out of prison after, 10 years in there for something you didn't do.
Approximately 6 or 7 policemen attacked me and put in my pocket a big quantity of drugs.
If we can choose how we live well, then do we not have the right to choose how we die well? And how do we do that with dignity?
There's never a moment where I am not in pain. It's exhausting. This bottom line is what it is.
I was born with a congenital limb difference. My arm, I have my elbow, but it was like underdeveloped from here out.
54% of those with disabilities are not working. If you're an employer, hire somebody with a disability. You won't regret it.
I've learned that us neurotypical people are the people who really need to learn from neurodiverse individuals. We are the aliens of this planet.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome. Today on Purposeful Empathy, I'm joined by Mark Wafer, a member of the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame and one of the world's most respected champions of disability inclusion in the workplace. In our conversation, Mark makes one thing unmistakably clear, and that is that inclusion isn't just the right thing to do, it's smart business. And he would know. Mark is the longtime owner of 14 Tim Hortons restaurants. He employed hundreds of people with disabilities across every level of his business, from frontline workers to leadership. At any given time, nearly 1 in 5 of his employees identified as having at least one disability, and that includes himself. Together in our conversation, we explore not only the myths and fears that hold employers back from hiring someone with a disability, but we also talk about the cost, the human cost of exclusion. We make the business case for disability inclusion, which involves stronger teams, safer workplaces, and lower turnover. And we talk about how empathy practiced, not performative, can fundamentally change our workplace culture. Listen, if you're an employer, a manager, or a colleague who cares about performance, engagement, and success, this conversation is for you.
So welcome to the show. Mark, how are you?
Thank you, Anita. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Amazing. Now, I learned about you, and we were just talking about this as a result of a book that I read called The Power of Kindness by Dr. Brian Goldman. He has a full chapter devoted to you, and you just told me that you're going to be featured in a second book about kindness, all the way by an author in Bangladesh. Is that right?
This is true. This is true.
Amazing. So I just want to ask the question at a very global level. People often think of accessibility in terms of like ramps and captions or maybe even compliance. I wonder if you could talk to the deeper emotional human side of accessibility that society and individuals often overlook?
Well, there is a huge human side to this because inclusion and accessibility means being able to live a full life. And for me, being a deaf person, I do need captioning. I can hear some of what you're saying today, but I'm using captioning, Zoom captioning, AI derived. It got about a 96% capture rate. So I can follow you just like anybody else can. But because of a lack of access throughout the decades leading up to where we are today, people have not been able to live a full life, which is the main reason why people with disabilities are marginalized. It's the main reason why we have the stereotypes. It's the main reason why we have a series of myths and misperceptions about what it's like to hire somebody, for example, somebody who has a disability. So there's a deep human effect of accessibility or lack of accessibility.
Mm. And let's make that personal. So I wonder if you could take us back to early childhood memories, or maybe the twists and turns of your own journey as someone who with a hearing disability. What some of the experiences that you had to shape who you are as a person, and then maybe some of the work you did later down the line.
Yes. So I was born in the UK. I was born in London to two migrant Irish workers who happened to be driving the red buses that are synonymous with London. And I went to school in London and lived there until I was 12 and moved to Canada as an immigrant for better life, better opportunities for myself and my brother and sister. And I was born deaf. I was born with about 15% hearing. So when I went to school, I wore hearing aids, which didn't really work and were cumbersome. And of course, along with that came, bullying from other children, which is typical of because we're different. And my experiences weren't particularly positive when I was growing up, especially when I was younger. For example, I was a pretty good soccer player, and I made it onto the soccer team. Never played a single game because the coaches thought, well, Mark's deaf, he's going to get hurt. And so I was sitting on the sidelines. My mother was a very strong individual, and so she was my advocate. She was my activist as I was growing up. So she made sure that I was in mainstream schools, that I was included in as much as possible. And she was quite successful with that. Unfortunately, she died when we were young. And at that point in time, I had become strong enough myself to advocate for myself, especially once we had moved to Canada. Because at that time, I was only 12, 13 years old. And people with disabilities tend to have lower self-esteem because they're constantly being put down or told, no, you can't do that. And so they tend to have lower self-esteem, lower self-worth. And of course, I was no different. I wasn't any different to that. I was like that when I was younger. But as I started to advocate for myself, I became stronger. I became more confident. And there wasn't too much that was going to hold me back at that point.
Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if somebody was listening right now or watching this conversation who is struggling with being different because they have a disability, what might you say to them? Second part of the question is, what might you say to their parents, the parent of that individual? And what would you say to the general listener who comes across somebody with a disability in terms of how they should speak or behave differently that could improve the situation?
Well, for me, a sense of humor really went a long way. When I moved to Canada, I was in grade 7, I believe. In grade 7, 8, and 9, I was bullied pretty badly. The school, the principal, teachers, they didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't have the tools to be able to deal with bullies who were bullying somebody because they were disabled. And I can remember with a person in one of my classes who was using a wheelchair, and they were bullied too. And so it's easy for those who think they can get away with it to look down upon those who they've already formed a negative opinion of that person's value, that person's worth. You have to remain strong. You have to be resilient. And what it does create resilience. I became quite a confident young man by the time I was in my late teens. And that was because I had to. Right? As for parents, you have to support your children. You have to support your children in every aspect of what they do. Be involved in what they're doing. And also be on the lookout for that type of bullying. Mm-hmm. My parents actually didn't see it. And I was too young and too nervous, I suppose, to go home and tell my parents that I was being bullied, only because I was different.
How do you suppose you became such a confident, resilient person? I mean, you said you had to be strong in the face of it, but I mean, what actually happens? Like, what were the tools, or what were the strategies that you deployed in order to get through those difficult times?
Yeah, I like to joke about that because in grade 9, I put on 40 pounds. Okay. And the bullies kind of backed off a little bit, right? Because now they could probably get hurt. Exactly. In time, I was able to deal with this situation logically. Humor played a huge role. I've always laughed and joked. I've always joked at myself, made fun of myself. When I do public speaking today, and I do quite a bit of public speaking, I make jokes about myself, and people laugh and they warm up to that. And so when I was a teenager, I did the same thing, and you gain friends that way. I had no choice. It's difficult enough trying to, and I don't want to focus too much on the bullying side because it was a part of my life when I was growing up, but also it was the challenges I had as a deaf student in a regular school. Now, the reason for this, my deafness was at the level where I really shouldn't have been in a regular mainstream school. I should have been at a school for the deaf. And my mother at the time fought that because we would be using sign language. And my English was pretty good. I'd had years and years of speech therapy, and I could speak. And my mother felt, rightly or wrongly, she felt that if I was going to a school for the deaf, I would only be able to communicate through signing. She was wrong. Deaf schools have a purpose, and ASL and LSQ are beautiful languages, and it's great that people learn to do those languages. But the reality is, if you can only sign and you can't speak and you can't hear at all, you are restricted to communication with other people who can sign. So your world is smaller. And that's what my mother was afraid of. And that's why she kept me in regular schools. But the challenge was trying to get a regular mainstream school to support me with accommodations, support me with extra help. Because they didn't understand. And this is the 1970s we're talking about. High school especially. By the time you get into grade 10, you're learning you're learning Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And it's coming across on a cassette tape at the time. Well, I'm completely lost with a cassette tape. I can't hear anything. And so you ask for extra help, and it really wasn't there at the time. So it was tough. It was just a challenge. But I got through it. I found ways to get through it.
Mm. Well, I'm glad you did, because you are such an advocate, and I'm so excited to talk to you about all the heavy lifting you've done and all the ways that I think you make the case for the business case, frankly, for why inclusion matters to workplaces. So I just wonder if we could move out of your childhood into your young adulthood. You're married, you have two children, and you became, I don't know if it was straight away a Tim Hortons owner, but maybe you could talk to me a little bit about your employment story.
So I went to college and I studied social work. I had a passion for that type of work. And when I graduated from college, I decided I didn't want to work in that field. I spent most of my life around cars. I was a race car driver for 33 years. So my passion was cars. And so I got a job working in a car dealership. And that's what I really enjoyed. I loved it. Worked my way up to fixed operations manager for a Chrysler dealer and did very well indeed. But in the early 90s, my wife and I had talked about going into business for ourselves. And the opportunity came along to buy a Tim Hortons. I mean, this is the Canadian dream, to buy a Tim Hortons. But certainly back in those days, it was such a great opportunity for us.
And I know that Tim Hortons has made its way south of the border. For any U.S. Citizen who's listening, maybe you could give the equivalent. Would Tim Hortons be the equivalent to Dunkin' Donuts or halfway?
Oh, much better, Anita. Much better than Dunkin' Donuts. I think the best comparison from a global perspective is a cross between Starbucks and McDonald's.
Okay, good, great.
Yeah, we're most well known for our coffee, but we have as many products as a McDonald's does.
Sounds great. So you had the opportunity to buy that with your wife.
Well, we bought the first store in the early 90s, first restaurant in the early 90s, and it's interesting because the fact that we hired people with disabilities happened in the first couple of days that we were franchisees. We bought an existing location, and so it was busy. But the owner, when he left the restaurant, he took all the staff with him. So I had all new staff on day one, but I had an existing clientele who had expectations. Yeah. So it was a disaster. We had trouble keeping up with the customers because everybody was new. Dining room looked like a disaster. Kitchen was a disaster. So I had a need. I had to hire people to look after certain things. And one of those things was to hire somebody to maintain the dining room, look after the kitchen, the garbage, the dining room, the dishwasher, and so on. So I put an ad on the door, and I probably, at this point, in business 3 or 4 days. I put an ad on the door. Remember, this is before the internet, so I couldn't put an ad on LinkedIn. So I put an ad on the door, and this young man walked through the door. Clint Sparling was his name. A young man, 23 years old, and he's living with Down syndrome. And he wanted the job. Now, I didn't have a lot of experience being around people with intellectual disabilities, so I didn't know what to expect from him. But what I did know, because of the barriers I faced as a young person, trying to find work, trying to keep a job, I knew that he was going to be unsuccessful if he was just cold calling. So I gave him an opportunity. I gave him a chance. And as you can imagine, we're working 18 hours a day, trying to get the business off the ground, working 7 days a week. And we didn't have that time to train Clint. So I enlisted the help of a local agency, Community Living Toronto. And they sent job coaches out. That's a service that's free of charge for any business in Canada. And they came out and they helped me to train Clint, taught him how to take a bus, taught him how to do the job properly, taught him how to wear his uniform properly, explained to him about coming to work on time, what time his shift starts and what time his shift ends. And it was after a couple of months of having Clint working in the store. At that time, I probably had about 50 employees. Clint was my best employee. He came to work early. He wouldn't take a break. And I couldn't get him to go home at the end of his shift. The loyalty of having a meaningful job with a competitive pay meant so much to him that the value was really mine. The value of having him in the store, because customers loved him. He engaged with customers. He did his job without any supervision. And I actually had to make rule changes for Clint. So, for example, my staff were not permitted to wear uniforms to work because they were in a subway, they were in a bus, they contaminate the uniform. And so I would make an exception for Clint because he wanted everybody on the bus to know that he worked at Tim Hortons. Right? You can't get that kind of loyalty in an employee. That sort of loyalty simply doesn't exist. On the first year he worked for us, he went away on his Christmas holiday. He went to his aunt's house and had a whole family were there. And they took a family picture on Christmas Day. And there's Clint in a Tim Horton uniform on Christmas Day at his aunt's house. Right? That's how much this job meant to him. And so because we had so much success with Clint, as we increased the number of restaurants we had, because we had 5 restaurants in the first 5 years, as we increased the number of restaurants, we also included people with intellectual challenges, people who either had Down syndrome, other types of cognitive disabilities, or people who were on the autism spectrum. Real jobs, real pay, and we had about, by the time 1995, 96 rolled around, we had about 10 people working in our operation who identified as having a significant disability.
Now, I'm loving this story, and I know it because you've spoken in my class at McGill, and it still makes me feel the feels. I can totally picture him at his aunt's house wearing the outfit. I just wonder I'm going to put my skeptical hat on for a second and ask the question, you had empathy for him and wanted to give him a break, giving your lived experience. So there's a sort of like empathic act that you did. And at the same time, you also were running a business. You were not running a nonprofit. So that if it didn't work out or if it come at a high cost to you, it wouldn't have all just been bleeding hearts. But you've somehow figured out that actually it matters for the bottom line. And how lucky are we that it actually is a sweet story too? Is that, well, what's the relationship to the do-gooding and the actually doing well as well?
Well, if you go back to the very beginning, I did this for Clint because I knew he wouldn't find a job elsewhere, and so I guess there was an element of understanding of Clint's situation because of my lived experience. Right? So I didn't do this strictly for business reasons. The business case can't really be recognized or understood when you've hired 1 or 2 people from a specific group. You have to build capacity. Once you build capacity, you start to see that. This is what happened when we had 5 restaurants and we had about 10 people working with us who had disabilities. We started to see patterns. These workers were not calling in sick. They were not taking time off. They were not leaving. In a sector, quick service restaurant sector, the churn rate's very high. Sometimes as high as 100%. Right? And so these individuals weren't leaving. And also, you look at the supervision. They didn't require any supervision. You showed them how to do the job the way you told them how to do it. They're not looking at the clock to see when it's the next smoke break. And so we started to see this pattern that being inclusive was good for business. Being inclusive was smart. And so in the mid-90s, my wife and I decided, okay, we're going to open our doors to anybody with a disability on the conditions that they could do the job or they could be trained to do the job. So to your question about, how much of it was compassion for that person's lived experience, I would say that's what started it. That's not what ended it. As we went on, we realized, hey, we were always aware that when people with disabilities find work, sometimes it can take years for them to find their first job. We're always aware of how their life changed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for example, I've had workers with disabilities come to me with their pay stub and show me the line that says taxes. And you and I, we look at that and go, oh no, taxes are too high. That's not why they were showing me. They were showing me because now they are not receiving benefits. They're actually being paying into the real fabric of Canada. They're part of it. And it meant that much to them, right? Contributing to the success of society. And this is just not one off. There's not just one person who did that. A number of workers with disabilities came to us and said, listen, I've been on benefits for 10 years, sometimes even longer. I've been on benefits, sitting at home on benefits, couldn't work, couldn't find a job. And then I finally found a job working at Tim Hortons. And now I'm contributing to society. It's powerful.
So you're giving us your story, an anecdotal owner of, I think in the end you owned 8 or 9 Tim Hortons stores?
14.
14, right. 14, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
So you have had your own personal experience hiring people with disabilities and seeing the success, seeing how much it made sense. If we took it outside of your personal story and we kind of looked at it more globally, what are the tangible outcomes of being an inclusive employer with people who have disabilities?
So the business case is made up of 5 specific items, as I understand it. The first is absenteeism, which is much lower with people with disabilities. For example, we had an average of 45 workers with disabilities out of a workforce of 250 at any given time. So about 45 workers with disabilities. Our absenteeism rate for that 45 was 85% lower than 200.
Wow.
Without disabilities. Yeah, wow. It's huge. And that can be scaled. So in the United States, there's a company called DuPont. DuPont is the largest manufacturer of automotive paint in the world. And they were a very significant employer of people with disabilities back in the early 2000s. And they found the same thing. Their absenteeism rate was actually 86% lower, so only 1 point off of mine. And so you see a cost savings because turnover is expensive. Not turnover, sorry. Absenteeism is expensive. Turnover is expensive too, but that's a separate issue. Absenteeism is expensive for any employer. The second piece is the safety rating. Safety ratings, especially in the quick service restaurant sector, a lot of accidents, burns, cuts, slips and falls. They can be very costly. People with disabilities tend to do things in the correct manner, sometimes out of necessity. So, for example, if you've hired a person with cerebral palsy who's in a wheelchair, they're not likely to get out of that wheelchair and climb up on a desk to get something off the top shelf. They're just not going to do that. A deaf person like myself is not going to run across the street without looking. I have to be absolutely certain that there's nothing coming. People without disabilities, workers without disabilities, will take those shortcuts. So I can say that anecdotally, but the reality is, and the proof comes from the fact that with 250 workers with disabilities hired in 25 years, we've never filled out a workplace injury form for a worker with a disability.
See, that's interesting because that's actually myth busting for me. Like my belief would be that somebody who has a disability is more likely to cause an accident or be harmed in some way.
That's the stereotype.
That's
the myth. That's the misperception. The third piece is the innovation factor. And then, of course, after that is the turnover. Turnover rates are very low. Our turnover, typical turnover rate in a Tim Hortons or any other quick service restaurant is around 100%.
So in a given year, the person will be replaced.
100%. Yeah. So it's you hire 20 people today, you still got 20 people a year from now, but they're all different faces, right? So 100% turnover rate is typical. Our turnover rate for the last 10 years that we're in business was 45%. Half. The interesting thing, Anita, is that the turnover rate for non-disabled workers was 55%. That is a bigger win for me because it shows that people, workers who don't have a disability, also want to work in an inclusive environment.
Yeah.
Okay? So 55%, which is half of what the typical turnover rate would be. And then turnover is so expensive. Just to replace one entry-level position in a Tim Hortons is $4,000.
Mm.
So you can imagine the cost savings. The innovation factor is another piece of the business case because people with disabilities do things in a different way, not necessarily a better way, just a different way. If you take that same individual with cerebral palsy, they get up in the morning, they take a shower, they get dressed, they make breakfast, they go down into the parking garage, drive to work, sometimes with hand control. Every single thing they've done that day is different to you and me.
Mm.
That's how innovation is created.
Mm.
So if you have a workforce that's made up of 18% people with disabilities, people who have identified as being disabled, you have a more innovative workforce. And this is where the business case comes from. And the business case is important because when we speak to employers, and I speak to them all the time, and we talk about inclusion, their eyes glaze over because what they're interested in is profitability, money, sales, revenue, not because they're greedy, but because these are the things that keep the company going. What are our sales increases over last year? If you're stagnant or you're going backwards, you're eventually going to fail. When we were in business, our payroll was $3 million. Well, that kept me awake at night because I had to make sure that my sales, my revenue, my profitability was at a certain level all the time in order to make sure I could afford to pay my 250 workers. Right? So it's a reality of the business world is we have to speak to them in language that they understand. So when I say to them, you should employ people with disabilities because it's the right thing to do, they won't do it. But if I say, if you become an inclusive employer, you will have a stronger bottom line and healthier profit. Or all of a sudden, they want to hear more.
Mm.
Tell me more about this, Mark. Because now we're talking their language.
Mm.
In a couple of days, I'm going to be speaking to business people in Halifax. And this is my message to them. Most of those individuals and most of those businesses will not yet have thought about hiring people with disabilities. I'm going to tell them for the first time why it's good for business.
And just to repeat those 5, let's see if I got them. So absenteeism goes down, turnover goes down, innovation goes up, risky behavior and accidents go down. And the 5th one was just.
So the 5th one is the overall optimism in the workforce. The culture of the workforce it becomes far more solid. And what creates this is what we call tone and intent. So for a small business like mine, the tone and intent had to come from me. The tone, strong tone from me. The intent, damn it, we're going to do this. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make it work. And for a large corporation, the tone and intent has to come from the CEO. They don't necessarily have to be involved in it, but they're the ones who have to say, on my watch, we are going to be an inclusive employer. And, for the right reasons. Mm. And then everything starts to fall into place after that. But those 5 elements make up the business case. And it's the only language that employers understand. Mm. So for employers who have never done this before, and when I'm talking to them, for example, when I speak in a couple of days, when I speak to this group in Halifax, if they go out and do this and hire people with disabilities, at the beginning, they're doing it because there was a business reason to do it. Mm. It's after they get to know people, they realize how they've changed their lives.
Right.
the positive impact it's had on their life. And it's not just them, it's their families. It's the whole dynamic that changes at home when people with disabilities find work. You know, it's taken years. One young lady who worked with us about 10 years ago went to Queen's University, got a master's degree in business. When she met me, she hadn't worked in 3 years. She graduated and had not worked a single day in 3 years. How is that possible in the city of Toronto to have an MBA in business and not work a single day? It's because she was profoundly deaf. That's the reason why she couldn't find any work. So by the time she came to work with us, with an MBA, working in a Tim Hortons, she hadn't been employed for 3 years.
So what are the demographics of disability in Canada? Let's put this in scale. I've got some numbers about US as well, but let's talk about how big this missed opportunity is.
Yeah. Well, it's the world's largest minority group. So it's Canada's largest minority group. It's 27%.
Wow.
27%. So 1 in 4 Canadians identify as having a disability. That number's growing. So the last time we had a census, back in 2017, 2018, that number was 24%. So it's growing, and it's growing because of age-related disabilities. Deafness is growing fast. The fastest growing is mental health disabilities. So it's huge. According to official statistics, 54% of those with disabilities are not working.
Wow.
54%, yeah. So half are not working because they have a disability. However, that's an official number. We know that number is actually higher because if you don't have marketplace attachment, you can't be counted in unemployment numbers. So, for example, we have, over the last 5 years, we have about 550,000 Canadians who went to school, who have graduated, and have never worked a single day. Of those, 220,000 have a post-secondary education and have not worked a single day. These are the ones who have never worked a single day. Others, of course, have worked, but these are the ones who have never worked a single day. So that 550,000 can't be included in official numbers because they have no marketplace attachment. They've never paid CPP, they've never paid taxes, they've never been on a payroll. That means that the real number of unemployed Canadians with disabilities is closer, anecdotally, it's closer to 70%. If you're deaf like me, it's 85%. If you're on the autism spectrum, it's 88%. And when you think about it, and you go back to the Great Depression in the 1930s, the highest the unemployment rate went to was 24%. And here we are with a 70% unemployment rate. And if you take a look at participation rates, that's even worse. It's 19%. So 19% of Canadians are not necessarily gainfully employed, but 19% participation rate of Canadians in the workforce for people with disabilities. So the numbers are dismal. Now, when I speak to business groups, the number they focus on is the 27%. And many of them will say to themselves, I can afford to ignore that. It's not that big a number. But they really can't, because if you take 27% of Canadians and then add in the immediate family members, so we're talking mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter, you're at 73% of Canadian population. 73% of Canadians are directly affected by disability. They either have one themselves or they have a loved one at home who has a disability. 73%. 7 out of every 10 people who came through my restaurant were directly affected by disability. How then did that affect them when they walk into my restaurant and they see workers with disabilities doing a great job, happy, earning proper pay, contributing to society? What effect did that have on them? Well, it brought them back. repeat customers. When we sold our business in 2017, we had 16,000 customers a day. So imagine 9,000, 10,000 people who came to our restaurant every day were directly affected by disability. It's absolutely enormous. And if you look at globally, the disposable income of the disability community in the world and their families put together is $8 trillion. A number I can't even fathom. I don't know how many zeros are on that.
And you talked about Canada, but I also, just so you know, I mean, you tracked Tim Hortons, and you benchmarked it against DuPont. You talked about 1 out of 4. Well, I just dug out the census figures from the most recent data in the States in 2022. Over 70 million adults in the US have a disability.
Yeah.
Figure represents 1 in 4 in the United States, including all sorts of things as hearing, vision, cognitive, physical impairment. So you've already touched on this a little bit, but let's make it super explicit. In your experience, what's the real cost of exclusion inside an organization, not just economically, but psychologically and socially?
The cost of exclusion is huge. And when we talk about dollars and cents, it's huge. But from a human point of view, it makes us very small. It makes us so small when we don't include people with disabilities in every aspect of our lives. You know, today you hear stories. Somebody's flying and their wheelchair is considered luggage. The wheelchair is damaged. You hear these stories all the time about a lack of accessibility and a lack of inclusion. What is the cost? What is the cost to the airline when you smash somebody's $40,000 mobility aid, a part of who they are? Instead of having the right mindset and thinking, okay, this is an extension of this person's body, we've got to make sure we look after this wheelchair as best as we can, right? You look at the air carriers in the United States, the numbers of wheelchairs that are damaged is just incredible. But that's just one example. A lack of access, a lack of accessibility makes us as humans, makes us smaller, makes us less. The cost in dollars and cents is astronomical.
What's one assumption about disability that you wish would disappear forever? And what truth would you replace it with?
Well, the thing about being deaf, if you don't know that I'm deaf and you start to speak to me and I can't understand what you're saying, and I've got you to repeat yourself, or I make an assumption of what you just said, people think I'm stupid. Right? And so sometimes people make an uninformed opinion of who you are. And that's happened my whole life. Today, I don't care. If somebody misjudges me today, I really don't care. But when I was growing up, it was very hurtful. It was very difficult for me. When I'm in a social situation, my wife is typically with me. She acts as an interpreter or buffer. So, for example, we were out Saturday night at a gala. Somebody at the table was speaking to me. I could not follow what they were saying, so my wife helped. But if she's not with me and I have to do this by myself, it's a lot harder. And so people tend to form a negative opinion of your value because you're disabled, right? Somebody who's having difficulty communicating with me will give up and walk up. You know, I might say to them, "Can you repeat yourself?" And they say, "Oh, don't, never mind. That's not important." Well, how do you know it's not important? If it wasn't important, why did you say it in the first place? Right? So you do have those challenges. People who are in wheelchairs are usually talked over, right? And you see it all the time.
So what is it?
It's really a lesson in frustration.
Well, that's interesting. So then what should we do? Are we meant to bend down to be eye level, or what's the good practice there? So you don't want to make anybody feel like the accommodation makes them feel bad. So maybe we make wrong assumptions. What's the protocol there?
Well, the thing that one of the best practices is what we call ATP, which is ask the person. Simply ask. Right? So, for example, I have a friend who is missing both arms, and he has a metal prosthetic, and very good. Like when he's got a shirt sleeve on, you don't even know. But his hands are steel, they're metal. He does not like to shake hands, and I'm a handshaker. So when I see him, I put my hand out to shake his hand. No, he pulls back, right? So I ATP, ask the person, may I shake your hand? When you find yourself in a situation like that. Paying attention to a person in a wheelchair is important. You don't necessarily have to come to their level. It's nice if you do. You don't necessarily have to, but pay attention to them instead of looking over their heads, moving on to the next individual. I'll give you an example of what happens. You go to a restaurant, 8 people go to a restaurant, one's in a wheelchair. Quite often, the server will ask each individual person what they want until they come to the person in the wheelchair, and they will say, what will he have? That's common, very common, yeah.
Yeah. I could see that playing out, and I could see a bunch of other ways that that person feels dehumanized.
Yeah. And if that was me, I'd run them over with my wheelchair.
Okay, back to you then. Is there a question you wish people would ask you about disability, but no one does?
I think understanding a person's lived experience. Everybody's afraid to talk to people with disabilities. A lot of people, or most people, don't have friends who have disabilities. They have a family member, and that's fine. They understand. They've got somebody at home they've got an aunt who's blind, or they don't necessarily have people in their orbit who have disabilities. So when they do meet someone, whether it's through a social situation or through a business situation, they don't know what to do. And this actually came up a little while ago. I was buying a new truck, and I was in a dealership, and it was just past the COVID, so we still had the plexiglass screen up. So the salesman had a plexiglass screen, and he was talking to me, but he was mumbling, and he had his hand in front of his face. And I said, "Excuse me, if you don't mind, I'm deaf. I lip read, so just move your hand away from." So he started to yell. And then he started to speak around the visor, as if I couldn't see through the visor. I ended up going somewhere else to buy a car because how can you be that ignorant? I don't mean ignorant in a rude way, but being ignorant of the fact that somebody sitting there has a disability. The behavior of that salesperson was just terrible. Right? So
yeah, it's a little akin. I remember buying a beautiful rug, and I was traveling with a boyfriend, and the salesperson was only speaking to the boyfriend, even though I was the one who was going to pay for the rug and take it home. So it's it's bringing up a memory for me.
I feel really sorry for anybody who does that with my wife.
All right, you've been very gracious with your time. I have 2 final questions, Mark. One is, if you could leave listeners or viewers with one challenge to widen their circle of empathy for people with disabilities this week, what would you ask them to do?
Reach out to somebody with a disability. There's people in your orbit who have a disability, reach out to them. Talk to them. Talk about their lived experience. Include them. Be part of their lives. It's 27% of Canadians. It's huge. It's a massive pool. If you're an employer, hire somebody with a disability. You won't regret it. That doesn't mean that every hire will work out.
Right.
It may not work out, but then do it again. Make sure it's the right fit. Use the same criteria that you use when you're hiring somebody who's not disabled, right? And it's interesting, just talking a few days ago with somebody in business, and I said to them, have you hired somebody with disability? Oh, we did 20 years ago. I said, how did it work out? Because it didn't work out at all. So we never hired another person with a disability after that. I said, have you hired somebody without a disability that didn't work out? They said, of course we have. I said, why did you hire more? Right? So it's about attitude and mindset.
Yeah.
So if I could leave just one thing with your students, and one thing with your viewers is just get out there and do it, and include people with disabilities in all aspects of our lives, whether it's work, whether it's education, whether it's transportation and housing, and sports, all activities. Make sure that people with disabilities are equally involved, and use ATP. Ask the person. Don't make up in your mind anything that will be prejudgmental about what you think the value or the ability of that person is. We employ 250 workers with disabilities. As a human being, you judge. And when I saw them for the first time, I judged. It's subconscious. I thought to myself, I know the capabilities of that individual. I was wrong 250 times. So just do it.
That is a soundbite right there. That's a compelling case. And we're going to include some information in the show notes for people who want to read more about the statistics around the business case that you have so eloquently promoted. Mark, the last question I always ask of my guests, and I never know what I'm going to get, but I love this. It's always a delicious, juicy question and answer. Is, can you think of a time in your personal life when you were on the receiving end, like a specific moment, not a generalized moment, when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Yeah, I can because it stayed with me for decades. When I was in the car business, I was poached by a car dealership, and I was working as a service advisor in the service department. And once I was poached, I was working for a new manager who took a great dislike to me because I was deaf. Great dislike. And he set me up. He set me up for failure. And I would come to work early. I would be the first one there. I knew I had to work much harder than everybody else to make this work. And I knew at some point in time he was going to fire me. The owner of the dealership got to know me, and he saw what was going on. So he fired the service manager, and he gave me his job. And I became the service manager for that car dealership. And what had happened is the owners saw the potential in me that I didn't even see at that time. But he saw the potential in me versus the person who already had in that position. And I thrived as a result of his kindness. He was the first person to say to me, what can we do to make your hearing better? And at that time, there was nothing. There wasn't anything. This is back in the early 90s, late 1980s. Hearing aids did not work for me. Today, it's different. We do have hearing aids that work for my type of hearing loss. But he said, well, I'm going to buy you hearing aids anyway. And he went out and he bought me a set of hearing aids. Well, they made things louder, but I still couldn't hear very well. But he meant well, and he was kind. He wasn't kind to everybody, but he saw value in me as an employee. And he promoted me. He actually promoted me. That's where I was working when we bought our first Tim Hortons. He actually promoted me to the fixed operations manager. That's the highest level you can get to in a car dealership, because you're looking after service, parts, and the body shop in a car dealership. So that was the one time, and I've always remembered him. And the kindness that he showed to me. I went from counting the days before I was fired to being very, very successful in the car business because of him.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. And we're sending that gentleman a lot of love. And I also now understand why Clint got a good break. You paid it forward, Mark. And thank you for all the work you do advocating on behalf of the disability community, which is 1 out of 4, as I understand it. So we all know somebody and we all need to reach out to them, right? That's it. I'm going to get off this call. I call my friend Ian.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I want to thank everyone who's been watching and listening. And we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.